Chapter 5. The Aftermath. We had no sooner entrained than we were fast asleep. After about an hour, the whistle of the train awakened us all with a jolt. We soon pulled into a station and all piled out, bleary-eyed, to be given as much tea and sandwiches as we wanted. But remember, it had been weeks since we had received a good meal, and it came as a shock to realise that we could only eat so much. On our way again, and there was plenty of time for reflection and recrimination about the course of what we'd been through during the few short weeks since we had left England in high spirits in early April, supposedly to prepare landing strips for non-existent aeroplanes. Was it really only 2 months ago? Probably on the credit side was the fact that what we'd experienced would be something to think about and be the topic of conversation for many years to come. What a remarkable thing the human brain is, the amount of knowledge it can absorb. And what about our eyes? What they have seen will never be forgotten. The poor haggard refugees who consisted of women, children and old folk, many of whom had lost all they held most dear, including their husbands. The helpless animals, scared out of their wits by the noises of war, the crowded beaches, and those young soldiers who'd lost their reason, that thick black smoke from the oil tanks reaching for the heavens, all those thousands of abandoned vehicles, the many ships which had been sunk in the water at Dunkirk in their effort to get the people away. There was also time to think about our salvation, because even though Dunkirk was a kind of defeat, in retrospect it was also a victory, in the sense that we had foiled the German attempt to create a catastrophe for England. Also, that the enemy now knew that the British soldier was a first-class fighter, and that England was not going to be the same walkover as the continental countries had been. Because of the stops we had to make, it took us 6 hours to reach our destination, which was Cardiff. We detrained, again being made most welcome by the people on the platform. On the road outside of the station was a fleet of coaches, strange we didn't march, which took us to a hutted camp about 5 miles from the city. There would be about 20 to a hut, and each of us had a metal-framed bed with 3 biscuits, thin mattresses, 3 feet by 2 feet on each bed. The biscuits were 3 inches thick and made a good bed. We also had 3 grey army blankets each. We soon settled in, because the only kit we had was the webbing equipment we wore, our small pack, steel helmet, and of course our rifle. And I'd brought my bayonet back from Dunkirk. Not many of the boys had done so. Many years later, I gave it to the Green Howards Museum in Richmond. On the beaches, many regiments had become mixed up with each other, so the returning men were sent to various camps and sorted out. We were at Cardiff for that reason, to be sorted out and sent to our own regiments. I was lucky, as most of our boys had stuck together. We did not have any gear, and had to wait until the full regalia of a soldier's kit was available, so we remained rather scruffy and unkempt. An officer came round the huts, taking our names and checking identity discs, and of course our requirements. It was not impossible for an infiltrator to have taken the opportunity to come over with us from Dunkirk. Right now, all different regiments were mixed together, just as we had been on the ships and the train. None of our officers were there with us, and there were only about 50 Green Howards. After the checking had been completed, we fell in and marched to the dining hall, where we had our first hot meal. There is no food to compare with good army grub, and it went down a treat. We had nothing to do at this camp, just laze around and rest our weary bodies. I lost no time in writing a few letters to my mother and friends to let them know that I was safe and well. Letters they must have been very pleased to receive. All our families would have known that we had been in the debacle at Dunkirk, and they must have been dreadfully worried, fearing the worst. 2 days passed, during which time we had been paid £2 each from any pay that had accumulated to our credit. Then we were allowed out of camp, even though we had only the clothes we stood up in. Everything else had been lost with the company stores. The days passed, during which time we had done our best to clean ourselves up so that we were more presentable. We had no polish for our boots, and our battle dress looked the worst for wear, but our first hot shower had been a treat, the first for weeks. Although we were a bit bedraggled, permission was given to go into the city. I was sure the civilians would understand why we were not our usual smart selves. Under normal circumstances, we would never have been allowed past the guard room. As a rule, when soldiers left camp on leisure activities, there were always 3 or 4 together. It was more fun. However, this time it was different. I went out on my own. I was still wearing my steel helmet, as I didn't have a cap, and we weren't allowed to go out barehead. I was the subject of scrutiny by the local populace, but they would know that I had been at Dunkirk, and were doubtless thinking what a story I could tell, because they could not possibly have imagined what had been going on over there. How could they? The truth was beyond imagination. I'd never been to Cardiff, or to Wales for that matter, but even then didn't really have the time or inclination to look around. The army environment was not the most conducive way of life to make us want to explore the various places we were billeted at. Probably the main cause of this was that we were always short of money. I was feeling rather low as I stood reading a news sheet which had been posted outside a newspaper office, when I had a very pleasant surprise. 2 ladies came up to me. They would perhaps be in their early 50s, and were well dressed, very pleasant and self-assured as they approached me. Although it was very obvious that I was one of the Dunkirk boys, well, I was only 22, they put the question to me, and when I confirmed that I was, their faces lit up. They then asked me if I would do the honour of letting them take me to their homes for afternoon tea. I jumped at the opportunity and cordially accepted without further ado, thanking them. My first experience of the Welsh gave me a good feeling. They were all extremely middle-class people, and lived in a lovely village called Fairwater, which was on the outskirts of Cardiff. Mrs. Owens, who looked the elder, was rather keen to take me to her house first. She lived alone in an immaculate semi-detached house on Bulch Road. After the 3 of us had had sandwiches and homemade cakes, we just sat, and they told me about their own circumstances, how the war was affecting them, and so on. They never mentioned Dunkirk, being such very kind, understanding and sympathetic souls. I was never to forget them, or the way in which I'd met them. To think that those 2 complete strangers had taken me under their wing and been so generous towards me. I was deeply affected. It was now time for me to be getting back to camp, but before I left, both ladies, trying to speak at the same time, asked me if I had any money. After telling them I had just been paid and thanking them profusely, Mrs. Jones asked me if I could possibly get out of camp the next day and go to her house to have dinner with her and her sister Alice, also her brother-in-law Roy. They both lived with Mrs. Jones. I did not have any problem about leaving camp next day, so back I went to Fairwater. What a lovely name, and the three of them could not do enough for me, and I have had a deep regard for the Welsh ever since. They dined me as if I was one of their own. I was made so much at ease by their generosity, and I knew that they must be curious about Dunkirk, so I told them of my experience in France. They just sat on the settee, spellbound, during which time the ladies, including Mrs. Owens, who'd been invited, being the devout Christians they were, broke down and wept silently when I told them about the refugees. After I had told them what I knew they'd been waiting to hear, and they had been absorbed without interruption, they all gave me a most welcome hug and a kiss. It made me feel great. All my 6.5 years in the army did not change my character and principles. I always minded my own business, had my pals, and got on with the job. Over the years that followed, I kept in touch with Mrs. Jones particularly, and spent 2 most enjoyable weekends at her house. All the family were so very kind to me. Margaret Jones sent me a Methodist hymn book, which is now in my souvenir box, when I was billeted in Southwold some years later, and the book is a treasured memory of days long past. It was very sad when I had to take my leave. Dunkirk was now in the past, and we were very much wiser men. The experience had taught us lads a great deal, and consequently we were much more capable soldiers, having endured an ordeal impossible within normal training schedules, and survived, all for 2 shillings a day. But with hindsight, under the circumstances, money was of little importance, and that was a fair sum to pay us for the experience we had gained and the knowledge we young soldiers had accumulated under war conditions. It would be invaluable to us in time to come, wherever the call of war took us, and we were destined to do quite a bit of travelling. I now knew what being an infantryman was all about. Chapter 6. We Reorganise. We were at Cardiff for about 2.5 weeks, having been somewhat mollycoddled, fed very well, and catching up on our sleep. Also, the boys who had suffered with blistered feet had been attended to. We'd done enough lacing about, and were now in danger of becoming bored, and we needed to be on the move again. There were men here from many regiments, and having now been sorted out, the time had come for us to rejoin our own battalions wherever they may have ended up. A fleet of 3-tonners was lined up on the road through the camp, and the Greenhowards filled 3 of them. There would be about 48 of us, plus a sergeant, and away we went. We ended up at Launceston in Cornwall. It was about 18th of June and a lovely summer's day. Quickly things started to get moving. It was a Nissen-hutted camp, the first time we'd come across this type of accommodation, and it would most certainly not be the last. First thing to be done was a roll call to see who had survived and therefore who was missing. It could have been a golden opportunity for anybody who felt the urge to desert. Now kit was issued to replace that which had been lost with the transport in France. Within days, the companies were made up to strength to replace the unfortunate boys who had been killed or taken prisoner. The new soldiers, most of whom were about 19 years of age, had been sent from the regimental depot at Richmond in Yorkshire. It was good to be back in my old B company, to be able to move around and see which of our pals had survived, and also to remember the poor lads who'd been killed. Comradeship is a marvellous feeling, and knew no bounds amongst surviving men. The company notice board soon made its appearance, and there was no excuse for anybody not reading it. A very important thing happened soon after getting settled in at Launceston. Whereas we had been a part of the 23rd Division in France, we had now been amalgamated into the 50th Northumbrian Division, which was made up of men who hailed from between the two rivers, Tyne and Tees, hence the divisional sign TT. I would become very proud of that shoulder flash as the years went by, as the division was to make a name for itself before the end of the war. The battalion now began to be brought up to material strength with all the paraphernalia of an active service unit to make us quite a formidable force. Weapons we had previously only thought about were now in our possession. The factories were now on a war footing and were doing well. We were given a full complement of Bren guns, Bren carriers, anti-tank weapons, 15 hundredweight trucks, plus all the backing the division could now provide. We had anything we needed to enable us to take offensive action. So we were now equipped for active service, but we ourselves were far from fit at this time and had yet to undergo some very physical and tactical training. Up to this time, any kind of serious training had been out of the question, and then, out of the blue, came 7 days' leave, which was more than acceptable to us. It used to be purgatory travelling on the trains in those days. Most journeys were undertaken stood in the corridors, or perhaps with the luxury of a seat on our kit bag, when there was a constant stream of passing military personnel pushing past to the toilets, and the atmosphere was blue with cigarette smoke. In spite of everything, it was all part of life in the forces, and it was a great feeling to be going home, even if only for 7 days. But that leave seemed to pass by in a flash. The first words anybody I knew spoke to me were, "When are you going back?" During that leave, I don't think I stopped talking, because everybody wanted to know about Dunkirk, which was understandable, because they must have been very concerned for my safety. But all good things come to an end, and it was soon back to my mates. For a short period, as soon as we were back from leave, we started doing route marches, kit inspections, and weapon training, amongst other things, to prepare us for life in the army. Just as we were getting into our stride at Launceston, orders came through for another move. This was early July 1940. Our battalion headquarters was at Hinton Admiral, near Bournemouth in Hampshire. The companies A, B, C and D were dispersed in different places nearby, but always on the coast. My company, which was B, came off rather well, as we were billeted in the grounds of Highcliffe Castle, which was only half a mile from the village of the same name. The officers had the distinct privilege of having rooms within the castle itself, and I, being Major Petch's batman, shared rooms with the 4 other company batmen in the servants' quarters of the castle. All the other companies were dispersed across different areas near the beaches. It was a beautiful castle and was still fully furnished to a very high standard. I can see it now, especially the large dining room with its long mahogany table, thick carpets, high ceiling and decorated walls. All the other rooms too were well furnished, though we were not allowed to use them. I was very sad indeed when in 1952, after the war, I went for a sentimental holiday with my wife and baby girl and discovered the castle to be a very sorry ruin. I returned to the area for many years to reminisce, and in 1993 I went for probably my last visit, and lo and behold, building work was going on, and I was overjoyed to learn that the castle was being restored. Back in 1940, the grounds of the castle were extensive and continued by way of sand dunes and a rather steep slope right down to the beach. Most of our time here was taken up preparing beach defences, erecting barbed wire and other obstacles, and laying mines on our section of the beach. Also by building gun emplacements with sandbags and setting up Bren guns on fixed lines. These positions were manned for 24 hours a day, and this of course was the period of an expected invasion. We felt very confident of our ability to give a good account of ourselves should the enemy try to set foot on our part of the coast. Our earlier confrontations with the Germans had given us the confidence we had been well-blooded in warfare. Major Leslie Petch was a very popular company commander, and he was more like a father figure to us all. Really, for a soldier, he was over-generous and sympathetic to our requirements. I recall that one day the bread ration failed to be delivered to the stores, and without hesitation he sent men into the village to buy all the bread they could get, and he paid for it out of his own pocket. Fortunately, he was a rich landowner and well able to afford it. However, his response to the shortage of bread was immediate. The necessity to keep ourselves fit was paramount, and since route marches were out of the question because of the possible imminence of invasion, we did a good deal of exercise on the beach. We called it PT in those days. We also did running along the beach when we'd be dressed in full marching order with a bag of sand in our pack and would run up and down the sand hills. We were on the verge of becoming fit. Unfortunately, the sea was out of bounds to us, or I might have learned to swim. The ladies of Highcliffe were very tolerant towards us in many ways. Whenever they saw us walking in the village, they would ask us to their houses for tea. I particularly remember one occasion when a lady of substantial means asked my pal Jack Cargill and me if we would like to go to her house for tea. But what a house! It was a very large residence standing in its own parkland. There were several ladies, many of whom were accompanied by their husbands, who were members of the Rotary Club, and they gave Jack and me a grand time. We were served tea on a lush lawn, sitting on beautiful garden furniture, and 2 maids hovered around us. Well, we were young and handsome. They were very genuine hosts and knew how to make a chap welcome. After tea, we were escorted to another lawn to play croquet, and since this was a very new experience to us young men, we were instructed on the finer points of the game, which we thoroughly enjoyed. We had had an introduction to how the other half lived, and it was a nice little interlude from life in the army. Jack was a good pal. I remember during the retreat at Dunkirk, he opened his mouth too wide to yawn, and his jaw locked. After cessation of hostilities, he became a Methodist preacher in Stockton, a town near my home. Some mornings I had to go into the village to make purchases for Major Petch, and a little old lady named Mrs. Fish ran one of the shops we patronised. After a while she asked me to have coffee with her, and only for 5 minutes, to listen to a short sermon and a hymn on the radio at 09:55 hours every morning. Those 5 minutes always gave me a great peace of mind. For anyone who is unaware of the duties of a batman, I ought to explain them. I did not do guards or fatigues, such as cleaning floors or peeling spuds, but participated in all other soldiery activities, because first and foremost I considered myself to be a good, conscientious member of our company. Also, it was paramount that I should keep myself as fit as the others. Batmen do not win wars. The night duty guards always awakened me at 05:30 hours. I would perform my ablutions, then go to the cookhouse for mugs of tea for the Major and myself. I'd go to his room, knock on the door, and wait for permission to enter. I'd say, "Good morning, sir," and pass a remark about the weather, then take my leave. I would then join my pals for breakfast, after which I went back to my room and made my bed and kit in the regulation manner. I'd then go back to the Major's quarters and ask him if he needed anything special doing that day, other than the usual routine. After the company commander had left to attend to his duties, I tidied the room and made up the bed. Unlike the other ranks, the Major always had white bed linen when we were in billets. I polished with vigour whatever shoes had been worn, also the spare Sam Brown belt, and every day I pressed his spare uniform. That routine usually took me most of the morning, after which I would have a good dinner with the other boys before joining my platoon for normal duties. The Major's wife came to visit him for 1 week, and they stayed in a hotel in the village. She was as much a lady as he was a gentleman, and she thanked me for looking after her husband. Very soon after Mrs. Petch had left Highcliffe, a most regrettable thing happened. Major Petch was sad to inform us that he was leaving us, and in fact was being discharged from the army on medical grounds. We were all stunned, as he was so popular with officers and men alike. He had never failed to set a good example of gentlemanly conduct to every one of us. It was said that he had bad eyes, but I was the closest person to him, and I knew different. With the benefit of hindsight, Major Petch could never have undertaken a company commander's duties under the conditions which faced us in the future. Mentally, most certainly, but physically, I doubt very much, because of his age and weight. He had been a territorial army officer, and there is a vast difference between that position and doing 20 or 30-mile route marches under harsh conditions. He often talked to me, things I've forgotten about, but one thing has stuck in my mind from all those talks. He was busy signing some documents, and he paused and said to me, "Cheall, always remember, never sign a paper until you have read what you're signing. Never take it for granted that what is on that document is what you think is on it. He shook my hand before he left and said, "Goodbye, Cheall, and thank you. I will always remember the company." As the Major left his beloved men, B Company also vacated its position on the coast. It had been a pleasant interlude and not a bit boring, as life in the army so often was in the future. So goodbye, Highcliffe. Swanage, here we come. Chapter 7. Training begins. At the end of September 1940, we moved to Studland Bay, a quiet seaside village near Swanage, Dorset. Swanage is very hilly, good exercise for our legs as we were constantly on the go. We slept on straw paillasses in the rooms of private hotels, which had been requisitioned for the duration of the hostilities. It was certainly a change from sleeping on the floor. We started to do a little training, route marches of 15 and 20 miles in length, and small exercises. Several times we covered the distance from Swanage to Studland and around Cove Castle and back. Although I now know that the scenery in that area is beautiful, in those days we never thought of it like that, no matter where we were billeted. Foot-slogging was foot-slogging, and that was all there was to it. The only highlight was seeing a German bomber crash near here one day. As at Highcliffe, we were still aware of the danger of invasion. Guard duties and beach duties took up much of our time, but these tasks did not mean that the usual army disciplines were relaxed, as we were not free agents, but soldiers, and we knew that vigilance could not be relaxed. At any time of day or night, a different platoon would receive an invasion alert. Talk about scalded cats. We dressed and armed ourselves in record time, then fell in on the street and ran like hell down the hill to man the defences on the beach, pier and promenade. There were also gun emplacements on the higher ground overlooking the sea. Some of the lads used to curse a great deal, but still appreciated this was a darn sight better than Dunkirk had been. The company notice board was very important, and woe betide anyone who missed an item which concerned them, such as the list of men who would be on guard on a particular night. For this we would spend hours cleaning our equipment, polishing boots, and it meant polishing, not just cleaning. Cleaning the brasses on the webbing, washing, scrubbing the webbing, which is what we called the shoulder straps, etc., then blancoing it khaki, pressing trousers. Then came the rifle. We always kept this clean, but on a guard parade especially there were no excuses for a speck of dust. Strange, but there was always the odd tough guy who didn't give a damn, so his turnout wasn't perfect. He hadn't had time to shave or something. Then he would be put on a 252. Queer, but usually these were really good characters, and in later years, when we were in action, they were the kind of boys who would do something very brave. When one was on guard in England, the day before was free to clean kit. The day after was free to try and rest a little. The guard used to be 2 hours on and 4 hours off for 12 hours. Once again, we were kept occupied with guard duties and beach defences, and many things became routine, all part of army life. General Montgomery had very definite views about the standard of training his soldiers should do their utmost to attain in order to perform the duties that future operations would demand of us. We were to train as we had never done before, and with that objective in mind, at the end of September 1940, we soon moved again, always on the move, to winter quarters at Frome in Somerset, or rather 2 miles outside of that town, and here we would be put to the test during the miserable winter of 1940. All companies of the battalion were billeted here, and the headquarters company, together with battalion headquarters, had taken over a very large, well-built old property which must have been owned by a very wealthy landowner. There was a wide, semicircular drive around the front and rear of the building, and stables and the medical room were at the rear. Other buildings were taken over by the transport section. All the property was standing around a cobbled courtyard. The building overlooked a large expanse of parkland, with clumps of fully grown oak trees here and there. At 2 o'clock, from the front of the building, and 300 yards away, there was a brick building which was large enough to serve as the battalion cookhouse and dining hall. At 10 o'clock, looking forward, a good many Nissen huts had been erected, camouflaged by trees, and in the centre was a brick building which served as an ablutions place and also for showers and toilets. The ground sloped away from the main structure, and the whole vista looked magnificent. These then were our winter quarters, from where we would learn the hard facts of life in the army during wartime. We were destined to do some very intensive training from now on. This had been impressed upon every one of us, including our officers. It was our first experience of Nissen huts during winter conditions. During the summer they were too hot, but now in the winter they were like refrigerators. When we breathed, our breath made clouds. It was bitterly cold. We had one small round stove in the centre of the stone floor, which was totally inadequate, though whoever had their beds nearest to it were not so badly off. We used to sleep in our long wool vest, shirt and socks, and with 3 good army wool blankets. Bed was paradise to us. We used to lie in our bed and sing the song of the day, or somebody would tell jokes. It was always a good laugh, except on one occasion that I can recall. We'd settled down for the night, when suddenly the door burst open, and a lad who'd been drinking fell in, shouting and cursing at everybody, drunk as a lord. He just would not keep himself in order. So three of the tough young lads picked him up, threw him on his bed, and said, "Now keep quiet, you bugger," only worse, "or we'll throw you outside." And that shut him up. But I think he was out for the count. Next morning he was as right as rain, and couldn't remember a thing. Here, for 2 months, we seemed to be static, as if somebody was wondering what to do with us. Well, they soon let us know. One day a message was read out to us from General Montgomery, in which he stipulated that the 5th Corps, of which we were a part, we being the Green Howards, must be prepared by the spring of 1941 to give battle to the enemy wherever they were to be found. We must be able to move many miles in transport, then face a march of 20 or 30 miles and confront the enemy, giving him more than he bargained for, regardless of weather conditions. We would be expected to sort him out. Training began in earnest, and no time was lost in putting orders into action in order to achieve the desired ability to fight as first-class soldiers. We underwent physical training, cross-country runs, route marches and pack drill. This was running in full kit. On other days we would do weapon training, stripping down Bren guns, mortars and anti-tank weapons until we could do it blindfold, naming all parts and function as we handled them. We had neither illusions about what was expected of us, nor any misapprehension about the intensity of our training at Frome. We had to be determined to reach the peak of fitness, and officers and men alike were going to be driven as never before. The playing at soldiers had finished. It was emphasised that we should stretch ourselves and put all our energy into becoming first-class fighting men, and in the process uphold the traditions of the regiment. There was to be no slacking or scrounging, and it would be stamped on in no uncertain manner. Nobody was allowed to go sick unless his condition was serious. That little lot gave us plenty to occupy our thoughts. Some of the boys used to play hell, and there was no shortage of foul language, but that was all part of the rough life we led. We did not pretend to be angels, but they were really grand lads and hard nuts to crack. To start our day, if we were not going on a route march, Reveille was at 0530 hours. We were awakened by the duty NCO. "Come on, you lot of pansies, hands off your cocks and outside in 15 minutes. Outside it was a real mean wind, too cold for a brass monkey. The grass was covered in hoarfrost. Great, if that's what you like, but we didn't like. Dressed in shorts and vest, we did a run around the park, or twice if the NCO was in a bad mood, and ended up with exercises, by which time we had a sweat on. Now we could do our ablutions and get our warm, long underpants on beneath our battle dress. All our clothes were made of wool. Breakfast was a 10-minute walk away over the other side of the park, and we were ready for it. Our food was usually very good and wholesome. As an example, for breakfast, we had thick porridge to stick to our ribs, bacon, egg and sausages, with plenty of bread, and a mess tin full of hot strong tea. In England I don't ever remember going hungry, which was just as well because we rarely had a canteen or a naffy. I can't begin to imagine the consequences of a battalion of today's soldiers being billeted in a place where there was no naffy or recreational facilities. For tea we had sardines and a 7-pound tin of jam on the table, always plenty of bread and margarine with tea. We were all good eaters. Strange, I never put weight on. When I was called up at 22 years of age, I was 10.5 stone, and I was the same weight when I was demobbed 6 years later, and I was very fit. The weather was mostly atrocious. We never seemed to be dry. Route marches were always done in full marching order, each section of 10 men keeping 3 yards apart, taking turns to carry the Bren gun. We walked for 50 minutes and rested for 10. There was a second lieutenant with each platoon, consisting of 3 sections. These marches had to be done, and although there used to be some mourning, it did not deter us from having a good old sing-song while we were stepping it out, and many a time the words were adapted to suit our feelings. It was no use becoming miserable, because we knew the job had to be done, and we were rapidly becoming fitter and stronger than we had ever been. I remember one 30-mile march we did, and we all felt a bit rough during the last 5 miles, when suddenly 2 3-tonners turned up. The regimental band had arrived to accompany us, and we didn't half-step it out. I have never forgotten that, and even today, many a time, I tap that tune out with my fingers. Arriving back at camp, the mobile showers were awaiting us. Standing out from all the route marches and military exercises we did, there was one I will always remember. We were taken by 3-tonners to a point on Exmoor, not a very exciting landscape at that time of the year. Bitter cold winds were blowing, which cut right through our clothing, good as it was. Then we did a 30-mile forced march, returning to Exmoor, followed by a mock battle which lasted through the night, then another 15 miles march and another exercise which ended up at 1800 hours, by which time of course it was dark and very wintry. We could not feel our fingers and toes. Hell, we were tired. Then up comes the grub, and plenty of it. Good substantial bully stew, followed by boiled rice. It was fabulous, but we needed it, because it was the worst weather that I had ever experienced in the army, and to make matters a great deal worse, it had been snowing for an hour. The prospects were bleak. Our sergeant walked amongst us and said, "Right, lads, bed down." The ground was covered in snow. But we were young, fit and tired, and we slept on the ground anywhere. We cleared out our little patches as best we could, put our ground sheet down, and using our faithful small pack for a pillow, covered our weary bodies with 2 blankets and the waterproof gas cape. Some of us slept together, so we had 4 blankets, and if we hadn't been all in, we could not have managed to sleep, conditions as they were. When we were awakened at 0600 hours, our breath had frozen to the blankets, and we all had our own little igloos covering us. We must have been tough in those days, but the sleep had been a tonic, and the cooks had sent up a good, hearty breakfast. During the night, a most dreadful thing had happened 100 yards away from us. 3 lads who'd slept too near the roadside, which was barely visible anyway, had been run over by a tank which had been taking part in the exercise, and nobody had heard anything. The poor kids would not have felt a thing, and only 19 years of age. We all took it rather badly. It had been a divisional manoeuvre, and all supporting services had been involved. For 18 hours we'd been put to the test in adverse conditions, and everybody concerned had shown the grit and determination not to let the side down. The umpires were all over the place and showed their satisfaction. We had shown our capabilities in mock attack and defence, and had not failed. But the exercise had ended in tragedy. Most of us had known those 3 boys. They'd been at Dunkirk with us, and now their young lives had ended. After that incident, the manoeuvres were called off, and believe me, we had to march the 30 miles to the transport which took us back to camp. We just dumped our kit on our beds and fell in for meal parade, and after a good dinner we were beginning to thaw out. Returning to our huts, we sat on our beds and talked, just a little miserable. After a while, somebody said, "Well, I'm buggered. It's time to get my head down," and we all followed suit. "Come on, you lot, out of it," came the shout. "Stop dreaming of home or your girlfriends. It's a man's army you're in, not the Boy Scouts." There was no running that morning. We all had a shower and tended to our sore feet before, once again, trekking through the frosty grass for breakfast. I don't know what is the matter with you all this morning. That exercise was a piece of cake. That was from one of our officers, who was turned out immaculately, and he had been duty officer in camp whilst we had been roughing it on Exmoor. We always took that kind of comment in good spirits, as most of our officers knew exactly how we felt and were always understanding about the mood of the men. That is the reason they were so popular and could always depend upon getting that little bit extra out of us. Our training programme had run its course when we all received a shock. There was a notice on the company notice board to the effect that we had to parade at 0900 hours the next morning. Our colonel came before us and said that we would all be going on embarkation leave within a matter of days. It came as a bombshell, but of course it should have been expected. Why else had we been training so hard these past months? Now we knew. We had reached a peak of fitness as never before. After we were dismissed, the speculation began. It was usually the married men who felt it the most, but fortunately the majority of us were single boys aged between 19 and 22. So we just took it in our stride. We all knew at that time where the fighting was taking place and were certain we would be going to the Middle East. Next day at 1100 hours there was another compulsory parade. Really, it seemed to be hilarious at the time, but we were fitted out with tropical kit. Within days everybody was given a thorough examination. Then I received a shock. My sinus had been causing me some distress for a while, but now I received confirmation of a problem when the medical officer told me that I had chronic sinusitis and that I would not be going abroad with the battalion. Well, to put it mildly, I was dumbstruck, never having given a thought that I would be leaving the lads under such circumstances. My thoughts and actions had always been most loyal to my company, and I was distressed. I had been with most of my comrades since April 1939, knew their moods and respected them for what they were, good, honest, and sometimes rough Yorkshire lads who would give their all for each other. Arrangements were made and I was admitted to Bath Hospital for 2 days to undergo an operation. I returned to my company for 3 days and my sinus was very sore, but it was good talking to the others, and I knew that I was going to miss their crude hilarity, smutty jokes and swearing. They pulled my leg no end, all saying that I was a lucky bugger, but at the time I didn't agree. I was really downhearted. We were like brothers and would go through hell for each other, and the thought of leaving them and going to a lot of strangers was an awful feeling. But as time passed by, I knew I had indeed been the lucky one, because almost all of them were fated to be killed or captured in North Africa. While I waited for another posting, I had to move to Richmond, Yorkshire, and I went to the orderly room and collected my travel warrant there. It was only about 30 miles from my hometown, but I'd heard tales about the Green Howards depot which did not give me a great deal to look forward to. But time would tell. From the back of a 1,500-weight truck, I took a very emotional look at the boys and felt the wrench having to leave them as I shouted, "So long," as the truck departed for the station. I always remember the names of my pals and officers. Even now, some years later, I can still see them. As the train travelled north, a kaleidoscope of events which had occurred during the last 2 years passed through my thoughts, and as a backdrop to these I passed a living picture of the ever-changing English countryside. Richmond was and still is a delightful country town, full of old-world charm, with the beautiful river Swale meandering along the valley, and towering above the river there are the ancient castle ruins. The town is the headquarters of the Green Howards Regiment, and a chapel there is dedicated to all who've given their lives in war. The residents were very proud of their association with our regiment, which was formed in 1875. I'd never been to Richmond before. I arrived during the 3rd week in May 1941. Here, new recruits were trained from scratch in order to form new battalions. Now then, can I say anything complimentary about our depot? It was in total contrast to beautiful Richmond, but nevertheless it was where our roots were. It was a large barracks, situated at the top of a hill, Richmond Hill. There was a very large tarmac parade ground, and the whole area looked windswept and inhospitable, which I suppose was to be expected, because regimental depots are not supposed to be places where one can recuperate. As the name implies, depots are where not-so-fit civilians are made to toe the line and are transformed, sometimes against their will, into dedicated soldiers. And just as important, loyal Green Howards, being put through the mill in the process. They usually made pals easily because they were almost all extrovert, which was very important, and they would learn the basics of what life in the infantry was all about from scratch. It was a good job that they did not realise then where their lives as soldiers would take them, and that life at the depot was really a piece of cake. The infantry was no place for weaklings. It was a hard way of life, but the rewards were great, and for better or for worse, that is where my journey from home took me. I had been in uniform for 2 years, so the basic training was not for me. It would not make me a better soldier, only a very bored one. My sojourn here would not be very long, just long enough to accumulate a few more memories, and until a posting to another battalion came through. I was more or less then left to my own devices, which was really no use to me whatsoever, because I was an active individual and needed to be doing things, not lazing about. However, I did the usual drill parades and all the other bull dished out by NCOs and a regimental sergeant major who had never been away from the depot. I didn't have any special pals here and was not happy. Promotion never entered my head up to this time, as I had enjoyed army life doing what we'd done, although the going had been tough in the 6th. One day, on the notice board, I read that applications were invited for anybody wanting to become an officer. I applied and had an interview with a committee. Although I was not told in so many words, the one thing that let me down was the fact that I did not have any independent means of income. I was asked that question. This determined me to remain a private for the remainder of the war. Though I was asked again about promotion, I always said no, though I did change my mind 12 months later. Shortly after this episode, out of the blue, an NCO came up to me and said the duty officer at the officers' mess wanted to see me. I spruced myself up and went along to see him, whereupon he informed me that he did not think I would be at the depot for long, as I was already an experienced soldier, and until such time as a posting came through would I mind helping out in the officers' mess as a waiter, since, according to my records, I was associated with officers through my job as a batman to Major Petch. So I accepted, as it seemed better to keep my mind occupied. The waiter's job was most interesting while it lasted, but more suitable to a soldier with less qualifications than myself, if I may be so bold as to say as much. I realised that I would soon become soft. I will always remember one captain who was a little older, as were many of the officers, because the younger commission of men were with the battalions on active service. This officer, when he came into the dining room for breakfast, always came to me to serve him. He would say, "The usual, Cheall." And he did not mean the usual breakfast. He meant the usual drink, whisky. Every morning was the same. He was a good man, but a very silly one too. The depot was usually administered by soldiers of good character who had served for some years in the regular army and were past the age for active service, which was quite understandable, but they did an excellent job of work in keeping the regimental traditions and turned out thousands of fit young soldiers. Once a lad had become fitter than he had ever been in civilian life, and was surrounded by boys like himself, he realised that the training he had undergone had been a good thing and broadened his outlook on life. Civilian life would seem so far away. End of chapter 7.